I'm Rachel Walker, 33 years old, and even after building a growing company from the ground up, I still wasn't anything more than the family disappointment. The annual Blake family summer party was in full swing string lights, swaying over the garden champagne glasses, clinking voices rising, like they were all part of some polished stage play. My father caught my eye from across the patio, gave that familiar smirk, and asked if I was still working from home. I didn't answer, just nodded as my phone buzzed inside my coat pocket. One glance at the screen, and I knew the deal had closed. I now owned 100% of the company they worshipped like a crown jewel. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to bite your tongue at a family gathering. Growing up in the Blake family meant you were always dressed right, spoke just enough, and kept your pride polished like the silverware at Sunday dinner. Everything revolved around legacy. My grandfather had built Kingswell Industries from scratch in the 50s, back when you could still do that. He made tools at first, then expanded until his name was stamped on warehouses and offices in a dozen states. My dad, Charles Blake, was his perfect successor, a man of few words and strict lines. He believed loyalty was owed, not earned, and nothing in life mattered unless it turned a profit. My older brother Grant was the golden child from the start. He spoke in boardroom jargon by the time he hit high school and had his name printed on business cards by college. Wharton MBA fast-tracked to head operations on the West Coast, and every Thanksgiving he had a new expansion deal to brag about. And then there was me. I liked asking why we used so much energy, why our packaging wasn't recyclable, why employees were getting injured on old equipment. That kind of thing never went over well at our dinner table. Grant would roll his eyes. Dad would shake his head and say things like, "That's not how industry works, Rachel." Mom would shoot me that gentle warning look, "Don't push it, not tonight." But I couldn't keep quiet forever. I tried their way for a while, internships, polite meetings, skirts that fit the part, but nothing I did ever fit quite right. By the time I turned 20, I knew I wasn't built for their world. I didn't want to inherit the empire. I wanted to fix what was broken. When I told them I got into Stanford for environmental engineering, they barely knew what to say. My father asked why I wasn't going into business like Grant. My mother kept her eyes on her wine glass. But I packed up anyway, left the East Coast with a suitcase, a few textbooks, and this sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better. Stanford was the first place I felt like I could breathe. My questions weren't ignored. They were welcomed. I met people who saw sustainability as opportunity, not weakness. One professor told me, "You're not trying to burn it all down. You're just trying to redesign the system." That stayed with me. I didn't have much money. I lived cheap, worked long hours, and started building what would become Verdant Core out of a shared office space next to a kombucha startup and a guy selling 3D printed yoga blocks. My team was small, scrappy, but we believed in what we were doing, helping factories modernize cut waste and actually make money while doing it. Back home, they still saw me as the girl with pipe dreams and spreadsheets. Every family visit felt like a performance. Grant would corner me by the hors d'oeuvres and ask if I was still playing with climate software. I'd smile and give them a stat. They'd nod, but it never seemed to land. They didn't know that one of their former clients had just signed with me, or that their newest facility was losing money fast. I had no plans to rub it in. I just kept building. Quietly, steadily. And then came the night of the party, the night my father handed me a drink and asked if I was still working from home. I didn't say it then, but I already owned Kingswell. The papers were signed, and by the time Grant took the stage to announce a strategic acquisition, the company's fate had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. It was the last dinner before I left for Stanford. A small family gathering at my parents' house, just me, Grant, Mom, and Dad. The dining room looked the same as always. Heavy oak table polished too much. China that only came out for moments like these. A roast sat in the middle still steaming, and my father poured wine into crystal glasses like it was a boardroom presentation. They already knew I'd been accepted. I'd told them 2 weeks earlier. But they hadn't really responded. That night was their chance, I think, to say something encouraging, or at least acknowledge it. Dad sliced into the roast, not looking up. "You've always done well with communication," he said. "Have you thought more about business school? You'd be great at Wharton." Across the table, Grant didn't even try to hide his smirk. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I've made my decision," I said quietly. "Environmental engineering. That's what I want to do." My mother gave me a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. My father set his knife down. "You think you're smarter than the people who built this company." His voice was calm, but it landed like a slap. "Smarter than your grandfather." "Than me." I didn't answer. There wasn't a right way to respond to that. Grant leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like he was watching a performance. "She wants to build solar panels and compost bins," he said. "Save the planet one blueprint at a time." No one laughed, but no one stopped him either. Later that night, while Mom cleared the dishes and Dad took a call in the den, I stepped out onto the back patio. The air was heavy with summer, crickets loud in the bushes. I stood by the railing looking out at the trees, and for a second I thought about not going, about staying and trying harder to fit, but then the sliding door opened behind me. Grant. He walked over, drink in hand. "You know Dad thinks you'll grow out of this, right?" he said. "The idealism, it's a phase. You'll see how the real world works eventually." I didn't look at him, just stared into the trees. "You're not trying to fix anything," he added. "You're just trying to be different." I didn't respond. The next morning I packed my bags in silence. No one offered to help. My father was already gone for a meeting. My mother stood by the door and gave me a hug that felt more like habit than comfort. "Be safe," she said. Grant was still upstairs, or maybe pretending to be. I stepped into the cab and didn't look back. At Stanford, the world opened. Questions I'd been scolded for asking were now welcomed, dissected, explored. My classmates came from everywhere, sharp minds, big ideas. Some had already worked in the field. Others were just starting out like me. My professors pushed hard, but they also listened. One of them, Dr. Elise Grant, took an interest in my early project ideas. She'd worked in public infrastructure for over a decade and had no patience for fluff. But she believed in systems that could work better and saw something in my work. "You're not trying to tear it all down," she told me one afternoon, pointing to one of my designs pinned to her whiteboard. "You're trying to redesign what's broken." That kind of thinking doesn't always get applause, especially from the ones who benefit from the way things are. I stayed late in labs, ran simulations through weekends, and kept a notebook filled with every small idea I didn't want to forget. And I started to wonder, what would it take to build something that worked? Not just for shareholders or profit margins, but for the actual people running the machines. That question followed me into my final year. I started a project with a classmate named Tasha, an early prototype for an adaptive energy system that could scale to older manufacturing plants. We called it Verdant Core. At first it was just late nights and shared pizza, but after we pitched it at a student innovation fair, a factory manager from Reno reached out. He ran a struggling facility and was willing to try anything. So we drove out in Tasha's dented Subaru, lugging a laptop and 2 binders full of calculations. It wasn't glamorous. The floors were cracked concrete. Machines looked like they hadn't been serviced since the 80s. But the people line workers, shift leads, they listened. They wanted better. We ran the pilot for 6 weeks. At the end of it, the plant saw a 22% drop in energy costs. Word spread. Quietly, but fast. By the end of that summer, we had 3 more facilities interested. We moved into a co-working space in Oakland, shared it with a VR gaming startup and a kombucha distributor. Sometimes the power went out. Once a raccoon got into the ceiling, but it was ours. We brought on 2 more people. Jasper, a systems engineer who could make any clunky factory data stream like a river, and Noel, a logistics analyst who'd left a big-name firm after blowing the whistle on some shady greenwashing claims. None of us had much. We worked long hours, slept on the office couch when rent ran tight, and ate more ramen than I care to admit. But Verdant Core was growing, quietly, steadily. I didn't tell my family. Not yet. The few times I flew home, I kept my head down, played nice, smiled through dinner. Grant still made jokes. My father still asked when I planned to get a real job. At one dinner, Grant turned to me while the dessert was being passed around. Still working with spreadsheets and wind turbines, he asked, "We just helped a textile plant cut emissions by 45% while increasing output," I said. He blinked. Didn't know what to say. But it didn't matter, because in their world, none of it counted unless it wore the Kingswell logo. They still saw me as the girl with a hobby. What they didn't know was that Kingswell was starting to lose ground, slowly, quietly, and I was paying attention. By the end of Verdant Core's first year, we had 5 contracts spread across 3 states. None of them were flashy, no Fortune 500 names or media buzz, but they were real. A grain mill in Kansas, a textile plant in Ohio, a bottling facility outside Sacramento that had been running on outdated systems since the early 90s. We didn't promise miracles, just savings, cleaner output, and better oversight. And somehow word kept spreading. We hired slowly, only when we had the money. Some weeks I covered rent late so we could make payroll on time. I slept on the office couch more than I care to admit. Still wore thrift store blazers and carried my one good laptop in a repurposed tote bag. None of it looked impressive from the outside, but something was working. Tasha kept our team focused, and Jasper software builds gave us a real edge. Noel came in 3 mornings a week with fresh bagels and insights about supply chain breakdowns that most execs missed. Every small win added up, every efficiency report, every maintenance improvement, every reduction in waste. Meanwhile, back home, the story was different. I visited twice that year, Thanksgiving and then again in early spring for Mom's birthday. Both times, the tone around the table hadn't changed. Dad still offered polite silence. Grant still managed to turn every conversation back toward Kingswell. And Mom, she stayed in that space she always occupied, careful and composed steering talk, away from friction and toward neutral ground. At dinner that spring, Grant waited until dessert to bring it up. "So Rachel," he said, reaching for the coffee pot, "are you still working out of that, what did you call it, shared office?" I nodded. "We're still in Oakland." "Growing faster than expected." He looked at Dad, then back at me. "Must be nice not having to deal with board politics and compliance drama. Though I suppose you'd need a board first." I didn't respond. Mom gave a little laugh, trying to soften the edge, and offered me more cake. But the conversation had already shifted. Dad leaned back, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "Kingswell just opened a new facility in Houston," he said. "Fully integrated, full capacity." "That's real scale." I nodded again. "Sounds like a big move." He raised his eyebrows. "It's the kind of move that keeps us relevant. Not every business has that kind of reach." That was the end of it. They didn't ask about our latest contract. They didn't want to know we'd just partnered with a mid-sized food distributor to redesign their cold storage monitoring system. They didn't care that our software had cut their utility costs by almost 30% in 6 months. In their world, none of that counted. But the industry was changing, quietly. Kingswell's name still carried weight in the trade publications, but I started to notice something else. A story buried in the middle of a logistics journal about a failed contract bid in Arizona. An internal reshuffle that removed 2 key executives. a quiet buzz among vendors about lagging technology compliance gap systems that hadn't kept up. At first, I ignored it. Then I started tracking it. One night while reviewing invoices, I came across an article that mentioned a delay in one of Kingswell's shipments. A former supplier of theirs had just signed with a smaller firm in Colorado. I knew the founder. They'd spoken on a panel with me in Seattle. They'd told me over lunch that Kingswell had ignored their recommendations for years. Still, I said nothing. Not to Dad, not to Grant. At that summer's family gathering, smaller than usual, held indoors due to weather. Grant was already on his second drink when I walked in. He greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, look who's back. Thought maybe your startup went under and you were here to ask for a job." I smiled. "We just signed a 3-year deal with Calcan Energy. 6 facilities." He paused, then nodded slowly. Good for you." Dad, standing near the buffet table, overheard. He didn't turn around. Just said, "Expansion's coming. We're about to go leaner. Vertical integration." That's the direction we're heading. I knew their systems, knew the tech they'd been using, knew they'd needed consultants just to set up basic automation in their southern facilities, but I stayed quiet. A week later, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Nate, one of Kingswell's senior engineers. He'd been with the company longer than I'd been alive. We met at a job shadow event when I was 15. He remembered the binder I'd carried and the 100 questions I'd asked. He asked if we could talk. We met at a diner near Modesto, coffee a booth in the corner. He looked tired, worn down in that way people get when they've been trying to fix the same problems for too long. "The new Houston plant," he said, keeping his voice low, "is bleeding cash. The layout's inefficient machinery's already breaking down, and there's no automation where there should be. It's a mess." I didn't know what to say. "I thought maybe you could talk to them," he added, "before it's too late." I nodded, thanked him, and paid the check. The following week, I asked Dad to meet me for coffee, just the two of us. He chose a quiet place downtown, same one he took potential partners when he wanted to impress without being obvious. I brought charts, cost models, a side-by-side of our Verdant core system compared to Kingswell's current operations. I showed him projections how we could cut costs, reduce downtime, and bring the Houston plant into compliance in under 6 months. He listened for less than 2 minutes. Then he set his cup down and shook his head. "Rachel," he said, "Kingswell doesn't need saving. We've been here 70 years. We'll be fine." He didn't look at the graphs, didn't ask a single question. We left without a handshake. Back at the office, I didn't tell anyone about that meeting for a long time, but I kept that file, and I kept watching, because something was shifting, and I didn't know exactly what would happen next. Only that the silence from my family was starting to sound a lot like fear. By the start of our 4th year, Verdant Core had outgrown its tiny Oakland workspace. We moved into a converted floor of an old garment factory. Exposed brick-tall windows still smelled faintly of cotton and oil. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, the kind of place that felt built to last. We set up a few conference rooms, put in a shared kitchen, and patched the roof ourselves after a storm one weekend. That same month, our software went live in a mid-size packaging facility that had once been one of Kingswell's clients. The team there remembered me. They told me they'd left Kingswell because the equipment upgrades they'd requested kept getting denied year after year. "Your father's company had a good run," the plant manager said, "but it stopped listening a long time ago." We were also awarded a Department of Energy grant for our carbon reduction analytics system. It wasn't headline news, but in our world it meant something. Enough to bring in new hires, enough to expand our pilot program into 2 more industries. Still, when I visited home, none of it seemed to matter. At a fall charity dinner, my mother insisted I attend. I was seated 2 chairs down from Grant. He spent most of the night talking to a local bank executive about Kingswell's vertical consolidation, whatever that was supposed to mean. When the server poured the wine, he leaned in and asked, Still doing the climate thing? I nodded and told him about the new partnership we'd signed in North Carolina. He didn't respond, just turned back to his conversation without missing a beat. It was around that time I noticed something different in my father, not in the way he acted toward me that stayed the same, but in how he carried himself. He seemed more distracted, a little quieter, his usual sharp confidence edged with something duller. I found out why not long after. Late one evening, I was finishing up paperwork in the office when I got a message from Richard Torres. We'd met at a sustainability conference in Chicago the year before. At the time, he joked that Verdant Core was the kind of company Kingswell should have started 10 years ago. Now his tone had changed. Off the record, he wrote, "They're talking about selling. Quietly. Not public yet. But the numbers don't look good. Your dad's refusing to shift strategy. Grant's trying, but he's out of his depth." I sat for a long time after reading that. Everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tap of rain against the window. I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in months, our long-range expansion roadmap. I scrolled to the list of flagged opportunities, the companies we'd identified as possible acquisition targets years down the line. At the top of the list, Kingswell Industries. I hadn't meant to put it there. At the time, it was just a placeholder, a theoretical exercise. But now it didn't look theoretical anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept going over the numbers. The factories Kingswell still owned, the contracts they hadn't yet lost, their national distribution web still mostly intact. All of it could be rebuilt. Just not with the same leadership, not with the same mindset. The next morning, I brought it to the team. We sat around the old conference table laptops, open mugs half full. I pulled up a proposal on the screen. No one spoke for a while. "You want to buy?" "Kingswell," Tasha finally said. "No," I said. "I want to save it." Quietly, through a holding company. If they knew it was me, they'd never go for it. Jasper rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not just another plant or division. That's the whole company." I nodded. "We don't take their name. We don't absorb their culture. But we do take their assets, their reach, their facilities, and we rebuild it right." We formed a shell company, Northlight Capital, hired a mergers firm to manage the front-facing side, kept our name out of the paperwork. 3 weeks later, we submitted the offer. It wasn't generous, but it was clean. And it came with a plan. The wait was long, quiet. My father didn't call. My brother didn't text. And then, on a Thursday morning just before 7, our legal team called to say the board had accepted the offer pending final documents. I sat alone in my office. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars moved through the fog in slow rows, and the streetlights flickered out one by one. I thought about my grandfather, about the tool shed he'd converted into an office back in 1952, about the first payroll he'd written by hand. I wasn't trying to erase any of that. I just wanted to build on it with tools that worked in this century. The annual Blake family party was set for that weekend. Usually held in the backyard of my parents' home, it was the one event every branch of the family showed up for. Lawn games for the kids, string lights along the garden, catering tents tucked behind the hedges, a champagne toast before the speeches. I hadn't planned to attend, but now I wouldn't miss it. The Blake family party looked the same as it always did, white tents lining the garden waitstaff in gloves, weaving through the crowd, and string lights suspended over manicured hedges. The guest list hadn't changed either. Executives' old family friends, a few polished younger cousins trying to network between bites of shrimp cocktail. I arrived just after sunset. I didn't wear anything flashy. A dark green dress, clean lines, no jewelry. Enough to be seen, not enough to draw attention. Not yet. My father stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, speaking with a group of men I recognized from Kingswell's advisory board. He noticed me as I stepped in. raised an eyebrow, then crossed the room and handed me a glass of champagne. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. Still working from home, I smiled. "Something like that." He chuckled. "Well, tonight's not about work. It's about legacy." He tapped his glass against mine and walked off before I could answer. The room was warm, crowded, filled with the quiet hum of money and memory. My mother drifted past in a navy dress, offering soft greetings and practiced smiles. Grant was nowhere in sight yet, probably preparing his speech. I stood near the side of the room, sipping slowly. No one asked what I'd been working on. No one noticed the small buzz of my phone against my hip, a message confirming the final transfer. Northlight Capital now held full control of Kingswell Industries. The deal was signed at 11:17 that morning. A few minutes later, Grant took the stage. He tapped the microphone twice and cleared his throat, waiting for the last few conversations to fade. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "It means a lot to our family and to the future of Kingswell." A pause, just long enough to gather weight. "I'm honored to share some big news," he said. "Kingswell Industries has officially secured a private acquisition. It's a new phase for us, fresh capital, expanded resources, and continued family leadership." The room broke into polite applause. My father stood off to the side, arms crossed, nodding with quiet approval. My mother dabbed at her eyes. Grant continued. "Our new partners at Northlight Capital will provide the backing we need to scale globally while keeping Kingswell's leadership and values intact." That was my cue. I stepped forward. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice calm but clear, "there's something you should all know about Northlight." The applause stopped. Heads turned. Grant looked up, frowning. "Rachel," he said, his voice tight, "this really isn't the time." "No," I said, "it is." I turned toward the crowd. Northlight Capital is in fact the holding company that finalized the acquisition of Kingswell Industries this morning. I created it through Verdant Core Technologies. A long silence followed. I looked at my father. "As of today, I own Kingswell." The glass in his hand slipped and hit the floor, shattering. My mother sat down slowly, one hand gripping the back of a chair. "You're lying," Grant said, stepping forward. "You're making this up." "I'm not," I replied. "The documents are signed. You and the board agreed to the sale. You just didn't know who was behind it." My father's face hardened. "This is a trick." "No," I said. "It's a solution. One I offered long before this. You laughed at the idea. I brought you numbers, proof, projections. You wouldn't look at them, so I did the only thing I could." "You bought your way in out of spite," Grant said. "Out of necessity," I answered. "Kingswell was failing. You know it. Everyone here knows it. But it didn't have to be that way. I didn't come here for revenge. I came to offer a choice." The room was still. Every face turned toward us. "You can walk away," I said, "or you can stay and help lead this company into its next chapter. But it has to be different now. Real collaboration. No more silencing. No more ego." My father stared at me. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Grant followed, slamming the French doors behind him. My mother didn't move. After a moment, she looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you wouldn't have listened," I said quietly. "You never saw me." "Not really." She stood, came closer, and touched my cheek. "You have your grandfather's fire," she whispered. "He would have been proud." The room around us stayed quiet, the weight of everything just beginning to settle. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't much left to explain. That night, for the first time, I wasn't the one with a clever idea waiting to be dismissed. I wasn't the girl they could overlook. I was Rachel Walker, and I owned the very company that once refused to hear my voice. The morning after the party, the headlines came fast. Startup CEO acquires family empire in secret deal. Blake Legacy Company transferred without warning. Verdant core behind Kingswell takeover. By noon, my inbox had over 200 messages. Journalists, investors, old classmates. Most of them were looking for a quote. A few just wanted confirmation. I didn't respond. There was too much to do. Inside Kingswell, things weren't quiet. Some longtime employees were confused. Others were flat out angry. I expected that. When a company has been run the same way for 70 years, any change feels like a threat. There were rumors, small ones at first, people guessing what would happen next, wondering if their departments were being replaced or folded into Verdant core. Some said I'd dismantle the company piece by piece. Others thought I'd move the headquarters to California. I didn't make any sudden moves. We brought in a transition team, half Verdant, half Kingswell, and started with quiet assessments. Where the losses were, where the opportunities still lived. The only people I didn't hear from were my father and Grant. Not a word, no call, no email, no public comment. Grant did hire attorneys. I expected that too. For 3 weeks they tried to find a flaw in the paperwork, some clause or inconsistency that could invalidate the sale. But the acquisition had been clean, approved by the board, signed by the right hands. In the end, the legal team quietly withdrew. 2 weeks after the headlines, my mother invited me to lunch. We met at her usual cafe, bright windows, small round tables, white tile floor. She was already seated when I arrived, a pot of tea steeping between us. She didn't ask for details, didn't ask about the transaction or the boardroom. Instead, she reached across the table, took my hand and said, "You really did it." I nodded. I had to. She looked down at her cup for a moment. "Your grandfather built Kingswell with his hands. Your father built its name. But you might be the one who gives it a future." I didn't speak. Just let the quiet stretch. Back at Verdant now merged with Kingswell's core operations. We started with the Texas plant. The same one Nate had warned me about. Within the first 3 months, we reworked the floor layout, replaced 2 major machines, and installed our own emissions tracking system. Energy waste dropped by 37%. Compliance was reached ahead of schedule. The plant stayed open. Workers kept their jobs. Some resistance melted after that. Not all, but enough. I created a role for my father, chair of legacy relations. Honorary but meaningful. A way to preserve history, retain long-time partnerships, and pass down what mattered. I sent the offer through his assistant with a personal note. He declined. The message came through formally. "Thank you, but Charles Blake declines to serve in a capacity where he no longer leads." 2 days later, he called. "I built this company to lead it," he said, "not to answer to my daughter. I'm not asking you to answer to me," I said. "I'm asking you to walk beside me. That's the difference." He didn't reply. A month after that, I received a package, no return address. Inside a book, an old hardcover biography of Ray Anderson, the industrialist known for pioneering sustainable manufacturing. Tucked between the pages, a note in tight handwriting, "Sustainability isn't the enemy of business. I see that now. You were ahead of us all." That I kept that note in my desk drawer. As the months passed, we kept moving. Employee retention numbers climbed. Emissions dropped across 3 facilities. Our software reached full integration in 2 distribution centers. And profitability, steady, measurable, hit a level Kingswell hadn't seen in over a decade. But numbers aside, something else changed. When I walked into the Kingswell headquarters, the same building I used to tiptoe through during school breaks, I wasn't met with indifference or judgment. People greeted me by name. Meetings started on time. Ideas were heard. And when I spoke, rooms didn't go quiet, they leaned in. By the end of that first quarter, the changes were impossible to ignore. We held our first all-hands meeting in the old Kingswell Auditorium, a place I hadn't stepped into since my early teens. The seats were filled with faces I half remembered from family picnics, company retreats, and holiday parties, folks who had watched me grow up, who had probably never expected to see me up on that stage. I didn't open with a speech. Instead, I shared the numbers. Plant efficiency up by double digits. Energy used down compliance reached and exceeded at facilities that had always struggled. Profits rising for the first time in years. For the first time, I could see heads nodding in agreement, not just going through the motions. Afterward, I walked the floor with the operations team, shaking hands and listening. I asked what was working, what still needed fixing, and who had ideas worth trying. People started offering suggestions, real concrete improvements, not just the polite answers I'd heard before. There was a sense that this time things might actually change for the better. Outside the company, the headlines kept coming. Some praised the turnaround. Some called it a fluke. But the calls that meant most were quiet, private old suppliers reaching out former clients, asking if we were taking on new contracts. Even a few companies that had left Kingswell years before came back to the table. Grant kept his distance, but his legal challenges had ended. He sent a short email, 2 sentences, no greeting. "Congratulations. Take care of it." It was more than I expected. My father remained silent, but the book he'd sent stayed on my desk. Sometimes late in the evening, I'd open it just to read his handwriting again. Mom visited the new merged office one afternoon, bringing a box of photos she'd found in the attic. Pictures of Grandpa and his workshop dad as a young man, me and Grant at company picnics with faces smeared in ice cream. She set them on my desk and stood beside me, looking out the window at the city skyline. "Feels different now," she said softly. "Feels right." I nodded. "It does." She squeezed my hand and didn't say anything else. One morning I walked into headquarters to find a small gathering in the break room. Someone had brought in donuts, and the team was gathered swapping stories about the new energy system and weekend plans. I poured a cup of coffee, listened, and realized I was no longer the outsider. I was part of something that finally felt like it belonged to all of us. We held a soft launch of Verdant's newest analytics software. Invitations went out to a handful of Kingswell's longest-serving employees, some of whom were nearing retirement. I watched as they tested the system, asked questions, and even gave pointers. Their buy-in mattered more than any press release or quarterly report. By the end of the year, employee turnover was at an all-time low. Productivity and morale were higher than anyone could remember. For the first time, people started telling me they were proud to work at Kingswell again. A new sense of purpose settled over everything. We honored tradition, but weren't bound by it. We kept the history, the stories, the old photos. But we built forward, smarter, stronger together. The new Kingswell didn't feel like the old company anymore. The halls I once walked as an outsider now felt like home. People smiled when they passed me. Some brought their grandchildren in to visit the office on Fridays, and others left handwritten notes on my desk about things they hoped we might try. Our profits were strong, but more than that, our days just felt lighter, like a weight had lifted off the whole place. A few months after the transition, I found myself standing in the main lobby, looking up at the old brass plaque with my grandfather's name. I thought about how much had changed, how the rules I'd grown up under no longer held me back, and how my family, for all its flaws, had finally found a way to let go of what no longer served them. Dad and Grant stayed away from the business, but we found new ways to talk softer ground to stand on. Holidays became easier. My mother even brought me a stack of letters my grandfather had written back when he was just starting out, pages filled with worry and hope, and the same kind of stubborn faith that had carried me through my own hardest nights. I kept his old fountain pen on my desk next to the note Dad sent after the sale. On days when things felt hard, I'd run my thumb over the grooves in the cap and remember how far we'd all come. The company's culture shifted in ways I hadn't expected. Old-timers who'd stayed through the transition started mentoring the new hires, teaching them not just how things worked, but why the details mattered. The past became something we learned from, not something we repeated. Some evenings, I'd leave the office late and see the lights still on in a conference room, a group of younger staff laughing over pizza, sketching out their ideas for the next big project. Those moments told me what success really meant, not just numbers or headlines, but a place where people could grow, where their voices mattered. Looking back, I don't think justice is always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, a slow righting of wrongs, a steady rebuilding of trust. I never set out to defeat anyone. I just wanted to make room for a better future, one that honored what came before but didn't stop there. Kindness and resilience. Those were the things that got us through even when the world told me to give up. If you've ever been told you don't belong or that your ideas aren't worth hearing, I hope this story helps you hold on to your voice. Every legacy can be rewritten. Sometimes all it takes is daring to imagine it could be better. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your own journey or lessons in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this, you're welcome to follow along. Take care of yourself and keep believing that change is always possible, no matter how long it takes.